So Gary, what's your passion? What do you do? How do you spend your days?
I spend my days doing a lot of things, but primarily I do my drawings. I walk around the city. I do yoga. I see friends, but I do a lot of my own drawings and reading.
And what kind of drawings do you do?
I do drawings on pages of books, old books, primarily art historical books, although sometimes historical books dealing with history of Zionism and Israel. But primarily art historical books where I take them apart and I draw on every page. I'm a little bit eclectic, although usually there are these kind of images and writing. For many years I left them in books and
So Gary, does it matter what kind of books?
It depends when you would have asked me the question. If you'd asked me the question a number of years ago, I would have said basically no, that the choice was made primarily by the size of the book, the nature of the pages. With time I became aware that the content of the book, the subject of the book, the title of the book, the language of the book, and also the fact that there were inscriptions had tremendous importance to me. And they were really oftentimes the charge that caused me to choose the book to work on. Of course, there are the other aspects of it, the size, the paper, and things like that, the kind of images that are on the book, since a lot of times there aren't historical books. However, there is a real importance to the kind of content and to the whole physicality of it. I mean, I think that one thing that people realize or don't realize about books is that they're kind of like storehouses. People make notes, people make inscriptions, people give them as gifts with different kinds of inscriptions. To Yossi from Milana, Undying Love, and then you end up with a book in some second-hand bookstore. Oftentimes people stick little slips of paper in the book. And books oftentimes, primarily usually, like human beings, also go through kind of changes. They age, and they're in the process of aging. They have like age spots, and they have different kind of marks, and they have stains, and they have these kind of like little ripples and things like that. And I think that those are things that that interest me, attract me.
In what way do they inspire you? Do they make you think in one direction instead of another? I mean, how is it different if the book is old or new, or it has a writing, a little slip of paper, or an inscription, or a spot, or if it's about Zionist history, or it's about hate books, you know?
It makes a big difference, but in a way that...
Okay. What makes it a difference?
Okay, the nature of the book, the subject matter, the aging of a book are things that make tremendous differences. For example, I never work in a new book. I think that the thing that attracts me is a little bit what the surrealists used to talk about in terms of the liberating aspect of sexuality. During times of ideologies, communism, fascism, capitalism, what interested them in the private life of the individual, and they really magnified the Marquis de Sade, basically for the reason that he was a kind of a symbol of sexual liberation. Since sexual orientation, sexual attraction is something that you can't control. And I think that the way that I'm attracted to a book is something very similar to a kind of a sexual attraction. You know the kind of woman or book that your parents want you to choose, but the kind that you end up with has to do with a much more complex series of inputs. And I think that when I know a book, when I see it, I know it. It's quite clear to me that I really want to work on it. For example, I find it almost worthless to stockpile books because it has to meet a particular need at a particular kind of at a particular time. And so that I see something and it's quite clear that I want to work on it. I think that there are changes. I mean, I think that my subject matter in my work is really my own subjectivity, my own sensibility. There's a certain kind of a language of forms and images and a kind of a thesaurus of symbols that I use. And so that there's a kind of like a base which is constant, and at the same time it's something that changes. The nature of the book reflects a particular kind of a mood. The particular mood that I'm in is something that also influences the permutations of the images and the kind of shapes that I use. And so that it really marks and gathers together a particular mood at a particular time, and that's really my subject matter. So it has to be really kind of a particular sexual reaction at a time, reflecting a particular reaction, a particular set of circumstances in my life.
But then you take it apart.
Mm-hmm.
You have this relationship with the book, and then you just take pages apart.
Yeah.
You take. Okay.
I think that.
Does the mood break as you're taking the pictures apart? How does it transition or change into from the mood you first established and the relationship you have first established with this book to ownership and make it your own? How does the emotional part work?
Okay, the emotional part in the process of recording my mood. Blocking things out until I actually begin working on it. And I think that actually slicing the book is really part of the process of really preparing myself psychically to work on the book. My father was a tailor, and he had a particular position in which he worked, which was very enclosed. And a lot of the magic of watching him work, for many years during my childhood in my bedroom, he used to work and he used to take clothing apart, and you would see the stitching. And the way that a book is actually put together is very similar in terms of the stitching of the book itself, the leaves that are sewn together, the folios that are sewn together, and the parts of the cover that are sewn together. And there's a process of getting to know the book, getting to know the different kind of a format. I mean, I never really work on extremely large works. There's a certain kind of a scale in which I work, which is a particular size till a particular size. So it's not great swings in terms of scale. However, each format is very different. Each paper is different. If I'm working on something that has borders that are wider or thinner, that's also something that has a contributing aspect. And those are all things that at first I begin to become familiar with the book and with the format of it, with the scale, and then I begin to get comfortable. And then it's clear to me what I want to do, and then I really feel comfortable, and at a certain point the work begins to wind down because the pages of the book comes to an end. And I think that one of the things that I find really comfortable in working with a book is that it has a serial aspect. I know that there's going to be 30 drawings, 70 drawings, 100 drawings. It helps me in terms of deciding, not having to decide actually when a series begins and when a series ends. It helps me also the serial aspect of knowing that not one work has to say everything, that there's one work and another work and another work and a kind of like a accumulation, which says something about a particular point in my life. We live not far from certain monasteries, the Monastery of the Cross. We live not so far from the tomb of Maria, the Holy Sepulchre. And these are all kinds of hybrids where there are a lot of different kinds of styles that accumulate over times. There are certain kinds of central structures, and then there are these kind of like additions that these pilgrims over the ages begin bringing and hanging up different kinds of lanterns. And oftentimes pilgrims come and they just make marks, oftentimes a kind of a cross. And you see these kind of like 100 crosses, 100 marks with these 100 lanterns and 100 other kinds of things. And this thing is really kind of like a community accumulation of faith, a communal kind of accumulation of a life force, of a hope for something. And I think that that's something that that I strive for in my books.
This is when you're making the books or the artwork that you extrapolate. Because explain how you do both, and what percentage of the book do you usually use for your artwork? Do you use every page or try to, or you just take 1 or 2 pages from it?
When I'm working, there's not really a big difference between the time that I worked on books and left them as books, unique altered books, or working on the books and taking them apart. I'll never just take 1 page and work on it, or 2 pages and throw the book away. There's something about the cover of the book which fascinates me, and I do periodic series of works on covers of books. There's like the title pages which fascinate me, and the Vorsatz, which basically means in German a kind of continuation. In Hebrew, a lot of the terminology for the language of a book describing it really comes from German, because a lot of the technology and a lot of the printers came from there. And I think that has a significance in part of my fascination with the book. But there are the beginning pages, there's the title page, the inscription page, there's the carpet page, there are the introductional pages, and then there's the body of the work, oftentimes at a different section where there are the reproductions. And I think that all of the pages in all of the different kinds of structures as a starting point have an equal kind of a fascination for me. And I think that each time they bring out something very different in what I do for the book. I think that it's interesting when you look at the history of the book, going from the scroll to the codex, that there was a change from the text to the nature or the relationship of the borders. That the borders at the time, maybe in the 11th century when it became common to have universities, that there were wider borders where people began making different kinds of notations and commentaries.
People didn't always write in books. In fact, there are some traditions where you can, and some traditions where they find it an almost heresy to touch a page of a book, let alone tear it apart. What are your feelings about that?
I think with illuminated manuscripts, not with papyrus, which was in use for about 1,500 years, much longer than, and much more important than parchment. But as long as it was parchment, and because it was extremely expensive to make the changes in it and to prepare it, it was quite common for people to make different kinds of notations or comments, commentaries, different interpretations in the borders of books. It was quite common also for people to scrape away the text, the ink that was there, and work on what was there. I think that the idea of palimpsest, of things that begin showing through from underneath, things that were covered, also comes from this kind of experience of scraping away and reading what's imprinted, or seeing with time something coming back. People also used to turn the book around and work in different kinds of directions, and I think that not dissimilar to what people do in books today. I think that one of the things that I cannot escape is that there's an element of destruction in my taking books and working on them. I never work on unique books. It would never occur to me to work on something that had just a few exemplars or examples of the book. The things that I work on for the most part are, even though they may be rare somewhat, they exist in large editions. It's not that I'm taking something and destroying it. I think within this tradition of Judaism, where something has to be buried, it does have a kind of heretical aspect of it. But when you look at the book from the time of the printing press and as a product of the Industrial Revolution, we're talking about books that the reality is libraries are constantly getting rid of books. People are constantly getting rid of books. Here it's very difficult, and people put bread and books next to the garbage so that people can come by and pick them up. There's still this kind of holiness that it inspires. And even though there's a destructive aspect, it's something that I try not to destroy someone's body of knowledge or experience or work.
Well, the reason the books, do you want to explain why we bury books? It's mainly because of the language, right?
I think that we bury books not only because of the language. In the Jewish tradition, there is also the holiness of the language, but also the holiness of the message. It has a kind of like an importance, like a body. Once something holy, once something with the words of God, like Besad or Bezrat Hashem, with their different permutations are written on something, then it has to be buried as opposed to thrown away. I've exhibited my works on pages of books and books in many countries, in Europe and the United States. The only country where people really ask me in a kind of like kind of hurt tone why I'm doing this on books, and if it doesn't bother me, is in Israel. And I think that part of it has to do with the tradition of the Geniza, of burying the holy books. And part of it, I think, has to do with the whole tradition of the burning of the books by the Nazis and before. And again, it's something that I'm sensitive to. But I think that ultimately creation and visual creation doesn't really deal with morality. And I think that we go back to really the kind of image of the artist that I given by the surrealists, that we're talking more about the private life of the individual, reflected really in his sexual predilections and orientation and reactions. And I think that that's the kind of room for creation that I really ask for myself. I think that John Cage talked about the necessity in his work, or the desire in his work, to overcome the limitations of his own subjectivity. And I think that for me, my own subjectivity, the limits of my own subjectivity, are really my subject matter. So it's my choices, my sexual reactions, my movements, my marks and markings, my accumulations, my choices.
If you want, you can mention what you meant by Geniza and Nazis. Remember, we're talking to,
Yeah.
you cannot assume anybody. Okay.
I'm not really an expert in the Geniza, but it really is a tradition and really a kind of a commandment not to destroy holy books. When a holy book is dropped, you have to kiss it. You're not allowed to take it too close to a bathroom or to a toilet. You have to bury it, and you have to keep it in an enclosed place. It's very interesting in Israel, in religious institutions, including many libraries, that there's next to a Xerox machine, There's a waste basket for throwing away Xeroxes or photocopies of books that you make photocopies of. However, there's a special basket for Gniza, for something that is going to be buried. And it's one of the things that's really, over the centuries, allowed really kind of these unintentional archives of Jewish communities and Jewish life to be accumulated. And I think that it's something, this awareness in my work reflects the kind of culture in which I live. People keep asking me about the holiness of the book and if it doesn't bother me. And at a certain point, even when it doesn't bother me, there's an awareness and or a sensitivity of that. So the kind of environment in which I live definitely reflects the kind of content and experiences that I have in my work and my relationship to my work, including really the kind of like holiness of the page. I think I began to become aware of one of the reasons why books attracted me so much when I began working on a book and intended to take it apart, and at a certain point decided that it really made sense to keep it bound, but it was a book that was really falling apart. And I brought it to a bindery in a religious neighborhood, and people kept coming in around my age or a little bit older with books that had belonged to their parents, and the parents no longer were alive, and they were rebinding it as a kind of a link to people that didn't exist anymore, but it had a real importance for these people. I think that the reason that I work on books, aside from the legitimacy that it gives, an altered book by Gary Goldstein and that kind of rush of seeing it, the kind of accumulation and serial aspect that I talked about before, but also I think that many Jews of my generation, many who were immigrants or refugees, many who were like my parents who were refugees and also refugees after the Holocaust, who had everything really destroyed and really came with nothing, no photographs, no books, no spoons, no silverware, no pieces of silver or jewelry, no paintings. And for much of my life I really grew up in empty houses with nothing on the walls and no books accumulated. And I think that even though in my living space, my Lebensraum, to use an unfortunate term, I think that I kind of copied it with keeping the space fairly clear, fairly quiet. However, I've developed a way of working on objects, covering them with Tipex and then doing drawings, taking pages of books and reworking them to really kind of reconstitute a universe of a lack of things that really deal with kind of like forgetting. And I think that for much of my life, there's been a real kind of a sensitivity in my work, a kind of an under theme of a fear of being forgotten, a fear of being of forgetting. And I think that the kind of like accumulations that I talked about, the kind of like passing these accumulations on to future generations are really the kind of leitmotif which accompanies my work. And I think that at my stage of life, I think that the realization, the recognition that I won't be here forever is definitely paramount. But really the consciousness of leaving something after me.
What prompts you to save a book, let's say, and going to get it bound instead of going ahead with cutting it apart, like that particular example? What was it that told you, not me, no?
I can't really explain with a really rational explanation of why it is that I chose to keep certain books as books, why I chose to keep certain books and take them apart and use them as pages of books. but it was a kind of like a sequence of events that had a lot of mixtures of things that I was going through. For example, I had for many years worked on much larger works and works that were on the wall or three-dimensional objects that were in spaces. And at a certain point, I began really looking inward. I began reading a lot. There was pages of a book that I was reading, and as the book was bound and dry and the pages began falling apart, I began working on the individual pages as they were coming apart. And it took me a long time to realize that the content of the book, the subject of the book, had a particular significance, which would have a significance much later also. It was the autobiography of Arthur Rubinstein, My Younger Years. And about a third of the book, he talks about his youth growing up in Lodz. My parents came from Lodz. And I think that it was interesting for me. He was describing a place of living. He was describing for me a place before a Holocaust, before a kind of like an erasing of human beings and human life and Jewish life in that place. My parents had different reactions or relationships towards recounting their experiences in the Holocaust. My father never spoke about it, and my mother never stopped talking about it, but they never talked about the experience of growing up before the Holocaust, before the ghetto, before the liquidation of the ghetto. And the fact that here was a man who was growing up in a living place, a place that was quite pleasant for him to grow up, a very cultured place, was something that was really very moving to me. And at that point I have like 2 shoeboxes filled with these kind of like drawings which I kept apart. At a certain point, without really knowing that other artists were doing book art, or there was such a thing as book art, it became clear to me that there was something that I had to keep bound in a book, which really projected me upon a certain kind of trajectory. Can we hold on for a second? There was something that really launched me on a certain kind of a trajectory. For example, every time I would show it to people, and there was a time that I really didn't show these books for about 3 years to anybody. I didn't show after a period of many years of showing quite intensively. I didn't show my work for about 5 years. And in many ways I had kind of like stopped being an artist or an active artist. And it was something that I found really important in terms of really redefining my connection to art and really defining what it was that I wanted to do as an artist. I think that I had a kind of like a crisis in the sense of the wall belongs, like many other artists, the walls belong to Leonardo da Vinci. I think that when you try to compare yourself to Leonardo da Vinci, anybody comes up short. I think that the subjectivity as a subject matter was something that really became important to me. At a certain point, it really made it clear for me that my subject matter really was my subjectivity. And also that there was something really personal that I really wanted, that I think that book and book formats really offer. That you hold a book, you almost caress a book, you smell it, you take it to bed with you, and you have a very kind of a close and very intimate kind of relationship with it, which is, I think, also something that I find really appealing in working with